Hello and welcome to Jewish Insights. At the beginning of Megillat Esther, Haman is identified as the descendant of Amalek, the tribe who unprovoked attacked the Israelites from behind on their way from Egypt to the Promised Land. Before celebrating the defeat of the wicked on Purim each year, on the Shabbat which comes directly before the holiday of Purim, in addition to the weekly Torah portion, the portion of the Torah dealing with Amalek is read. This Shabbat is called Shabbat Zachor, the Shabbat of Remembrance. It is a special mitzvah, commandment of the Torah to hear the reading and thus to remember. We read, "Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt, how undeterred by fear of God, he surprised you on the march when you were famished and weary, and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. Therefore, when the Lord your God grants you safety from all your enemies around you, in the land the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget." Various interpretations are offered to understand Amalek's hatred of the Jewish people and their actions, and why Amalek is the arch enemy of Israel. Two which are clear from these verses are, one, they represent evil in its purest form, in that Amalek's attack was unprovoked, and they attacked the Israelites from behind and went after the weak and the stragglers. And second, they were undeterred by fear of God. Amalek represents denial of God's existence and seeks to blot out the Jewish people in order to successfully blot out belief in God. The rabbis elucidate that the Jews are commanded to always remember Amalek, to never forget Amalek, and to eradicate Amalek from this world. We've discussed in the past how the Jewish calendar is an eternal spiral, returning to the same questions but at a different time each year. So as we prepare for Shabbat Zachor, the Shabbat of remembering Amalek, we ask, who or what is Amalek? How do we think about Amalek this year? And what are our obligations this year related to Amalek? In thinking about these questions, my first call was to our guest today, Dr. Michal Bitton. My friend Michal is a Torah teacher, thought leader, a sociologist of American Jews, and a spiritual entrepreneur. She leads the Downtown Minyan in New York City and is a visiting researcher at NYU Wagner. She is a sociologist of American Jews and currently directs the National Study of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews in the United States. Michal is a new pluralist field builder, a Maimonides Fund Fellow, and a Sachs Scholar, and is the co-host of a new podcast called Wondering Jews. Michal and I were in the Wexner Graduate Fellowship together, and she became both my friend and my teacher at the Shalom Hartman Institute, where she is a research fellow. You may know her best from her viral speech at the Never Again Is Now rally at NYU just weeks after October 7th, or from her moving and inspiring address at the March for Israel rally in Washington, D.C. the following month. Welcome, Michal.
Hi, Justin. Great to be here.
Great to have you. So I'm just going to start with, really before we get into anything, I just want to ask, I know you've been on the road, you've been doing so much, kind of this explosion of October 7th affected everyone, but you in particular have been kind of at the forefront of speaking about this. How are you, Michal?
How am I? I don't think I'm the only one who would say that I have my pre-October 7th person, and I'm a different person post-October 7th. And I think there's been almost this equilibrium of trying to, on the one hand, see everything that's around us and respond to it and being overwhelmed by it, and also try to keep perspective. We are here in the United States. I know my relatives are in Israel. I have cousins fighting in Gaza, and trying to both take seriously the battles that we have in front of us here in America, and also remember that my brothers and sisters in Israel are literally at war right now. So it's a little bit as to like the mindset of what comes up when you ask me how I'm doing.
Got it. And what about, are you sleeping, or are you exhausted, or are you running around? Like, what about emotionally? Share with us a little bit. Share with me a little bit.
This is like a therapy
session.
session.
Deep. Come on, Michal.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah. Listen, it's hard. It's I'm also a mother. I have young children, so a lot of juggling. I would say that what's hard for me right now is kind of balancing emotionally this sense of hope and optimism and being in like a warrior mode, like we can do it, and also just like looking at our world and seeing a lot of brokenness. And that to me is what's really hard emotionally right now. It's not the logistical juggling, which I have, it's the logistical juggling with trying to do a lot and respond to a lot while living in a moment that feels like it's deeply uncertain and like it's going to define our people and our civilization.
So you mentioned brokenness, which I can relate to. talk me through, just from where you're sitting, you're one of those people who, some people I feel like they were busy with other things, then October 7th happened and it caught their attention, but you're one of the people that I heard you speak about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and what's happening on campuses and what's going on in the world for several years before October 7th. Talk me through, from where you're sitting, kind of, how do we get to October 7th? I know that's a big question. And then also, what has happened since October 7th? Talk to me about the brokenness.
Yeah, so as you're mentioning, Justin, and I'm not the only one, but I think many of us were concerned for years with a lot of trends that we were seeing. Some trends we can talk about, just illiberal trends in general in society. And I think when any society becomes degraded, it's never good for the Jews. So just seeing trends in our American society. I'm
going to pause you there first. Just break down illiberal trends for me. What does that mean when you say illiberal trends?
So some examples, for example, is like young people who increasingly oppose free speech and dialogue around difficult things. That's an illiberal trend of people becoming less compelled to say we live in a democracy where we get to be good people who disagree over important things, and when we have to actually persuade each other in the public square as citizens. And an illiberal trend is to shut people down when we don't want to hear them, and basically to say, like, our spectrum of what is good is very narrow, and if you don't fall within this, we're going to claim that you are harming us, and as such not allow you here. So there's been many observers who've been kind of like noticing this for years. And there's been many people, I would count myself amongst them, that have not just noticed these trends, but also feel like America, part of what made America such a promised land for Jews was its character as a liberal democracy, and as a liberal democracy that has been open and pluralistic and diverse. So when you're beginning to see a breakdown, a rupture in the fabric of what made America great, it is definitely something worrisome for, not just for America, but for American Jews.
Got it. So we have, that's super helpful. We're coming, so one of the trends you're noticing is the break away, like becoming a little bit more liberal that you mentioned. There's these illiberal trends, let's say, and then I cut you off before. You were saying, what were the other things that you were noticing kind of coming up to October 7th, and then what has happened since then?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, and we can spend the whole time doing diagnostics. But yes, there's a...
You're not a historian, I know, you're a sociologist, but that also is a little bit of seeing what the people are doing.
I mean, I think we had a heyday of liberal democracy around the world in which we thought like Western liberalism kind of triumphed. And that's what I mean, that we've been noticing just kind of like a degrading of liberal democracy in general. And within America, a lot of worrisome trends, including polarization and just broken culture in our media, except for you guys, and our politics and all that. And I think also you can talk about trends when it comes to Jews and when it comes to Israel. The fact that Israel, right, which is a country that is deeply flawed, like most countries, but the fact that in so many spaces, Israel became so demonized that you couldn't really speak about it without being immediately accused of something. I mean, we saw that before October 7th. It got really bad on October 7th, but we've seen it for years already. And I would say, and I will add to this, I do think that I have also seen worrying trends just regarding American Jews themselves. So a lot of American Jews who, I think American Jews for a long time, inhabited certain classical liberal values, a pride in America, a pride in our American Jewish experience. And there's been, because of many reasons, there's been almost like a breakdown of that itself, which to me has been worrisome as well.
And then we have October 7th. I remember everyone kind of saying, like, Israel will have 2 days to respond and the world's going to turn against them. And then I remember also, of course, the explosion of anti-Semitism that happened in America. Were you surprised by what happened with anti-Semitism in America? Let's start there.
Yeah, I think I was definitely surprised. The trends were there, but to see the extent and almost like the shamelessness that accompanied some of these manifestations in such a deep way was incredibly, incredibly destabilizing. I think, you know what was destabilizing, Justin, when I try to explain it to people? Because people often say, well, you have all this pro-Palestinian protest or movement, and I'm like, no, 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 no. If that was the case, if after October 7th you had hundreds of thousands of people who would have been speaking up for the Palestinian people, that's a different story. What you've had here very clearly has been a blurring of the lines between being pro-Palestinian and being pro-Hamas. So that's I think what shocked me. Like, it's almost like I wish there was a healthy pro-Palestinian liberation movement that was not pro-Hamas.
Right.
But what we've seen around our streets and in many spaces has been just like open sentiment of justifying and legitimating Hamas and its allies, right? Like Iran, the Houthis, like all of these groups, like open sentiment kind of like legitimating them and at times applauding them and like cheering them on. And that is what was so horrifying and yeah, it did surprise me.
I think that hit me hard also. Kind of, it just became so conflated. It was kind of just like cheering what Hamas did as a way to say that you're, pro-Palestinian liberation, feels like.
Yeah, I mean, just this Friday I was in Union Square, big protest organized by an organization called Within Our Lifetimes, which is one of the main activist groups, and the big banners they use is by all means necessary,
right.
Which is like, it's a way of saying murder and rape and violence can be justified.
Right, and it makes me wonder also if that's once October 7th happened, they needed to take that line to defend it, or if people felt that way always, and October 7th was just like a symbol of that.
Right. I think what you're saying is that people kind of like put themselves in a corner. That once you're anti-Israel and you believe in resistance, that you need to find kind of like the acrobatics to justify that. Yeah, I don't know, and I also don't know how much it matters. What I mean by this is that I keep having a lot of conversations with people who keep trying to say, well, there might be a lot of people with good intentions, they might not know what they're saying, this and that. And part of me just keeps thinking, and it's a real question, I might change my mind, tomorrow. Great. But good, okay. But I keep wondering, I'm like, so much of history occurs pushed by people who were naive or had good intentions or didn't realize what they were supporting. Right. But it doesn't, I'm like, who
cares?
I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. You see these videos on the internet of people being like asked what their political views are, and they share, pro-Hamas views, and they say, by the way, do you know that Hamas, feels this way about women and this way about LGBTQ people, and they're shocked that it's like they haven't been educated before. And so it feels like to me that there's no, it's not about people like sitting down, laying out information and having a rational thought. It feels very like momentum driven, that there's like a few people pushing and other people are just kind of piling on because it's like the trendy thing to do. Yeah,
it's the ideologues and then the mobs. I was thinking a lot about this a couple of weeks ago with the scene of the golden calf. Because at the end of the day, when you look at how many people were punished, it's not a big group. It's like, what, 3,000 people? Right? It's a tiny group. But they end up basically making the whole people kind of sin, or at least being seen as though they sin. And to me, that was like a really important lesson, that even if there are silent majorities that are good, if the silent majorities that are good allow for small extremist groups to take over, they can destroy societies.
Right. When you raise the golden calf, that raises, I know Barry Weiss's speech, she kind of brings the idea of that Aaron made a mistake by appeasing the crowd there. This idea that when people want to do bad things, we're constantly trying to appease them. And I think one of the things that is starting to like bubble up here is, and maybe it brings us to Amalek, is this idea of like, when you have a mindset that the goal is to just make peace, to appease, to try to satisfy, that everyone's being rational here, let's just get together and talk it out, it'll be okay. But is there a point beyond which where it says, no, this is something different? It's not just about appeasing people that oppose you, there's something bigger here, there's an enemy here of some kind.
Right, yeah, and I would agree. I think that that Aaron kind of crafting the golden calf, to me that's like a failure of leadership. He basically blames the people. It's like he kind of says, they made me do it. And like, that's what I don't mean to sound like irreverent, but as a parent, that's what my kid tells me. Like, my sister made me do it. You know what I mean? I'm like, that doesn't fly. There's a lot of commentators that kind of explain in a deeper way, but at the same time, I think our tradition does not shy away to show when we mess up. And that's one of those moments. And I think before we go into Amalek, I think that's where you're going right now, Justin, I do just want to note that part of the reason that things feel so unstable right now in America and in the West is that we have these liberal democracies in which we've invited a lot of groups and a lot of ideas. And it's like, what happens when you have illiberal ideas or illiberal groups within a liberal democracy?
Right. And isn't the democracy supposed to keep them at the margins, but suddenly they're not? That's what's going on here?
Well, I think it's been like an age-old question for like the last, I don't know how many years, of like, what do you do? Because on the one hand, you believe in pluralism, in giving everybody a seat at the table, but what if you're giving a seat at the table to someone whose main values are to destroy that container of multiple ideas? So that's like a huge question around like the limits of liberal pluralism and how do you maintain a society that has diversity within it and also believes in certain values at the same time.
So talk about getting pushed into a corner, right? Because now the liberal Democrats are in a corner because they are forced to say, we can't be liberal with you because you're coming to destroy us.
Well, I really think that is one of the big questions. I think when we think about, there's a lot of migration that also has to do with this because people from different countries will often have been shaped by different values. So I think all around the West, you have these huge questions of like, how do we do this in a way that honors our liberal democratic principles? And when I say democratic, I don't mean Democrat Republican, I mean like a democracy, right? How do we honor this? And also how do we integrate, incorporate people who just have very different notions of the good.
This for me raises a little bit about 9/11. I think also it's kind of like, it feels like that moment where like everything's a perfect, pluralistic, liberal, democratic bubble, and then something pops the bubble, and then trying to navigate how to respond to that without losing your character has kind of been the challenge of this century, I would say, for America, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big questions.
One of them, that's fine.
One of them.
And then before we get to Amalek, something else you kind of hinted at there was, I've heard you talk before October 7th about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and now, it feels like, certainly to me, that those things it's really hard to tell those apart at this point. Do you still see, some daylight between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, or is it simply like at this point everyone just kind of squeezing it together and piling on?
Yeah, so I think that I will continue to concede that you can have individuals who are anti-Zionist who are not anti-Semitic, but I will insist that the anti-Zionist movement is 100% anti-Semitic. Okay, so the loud voices, those who are leading, those who are trying to really advocate for anti-Zionism, to me there's no question around that. I actually, you mentioned the podcast I'm doing. I just did this episode with my co-host, Noam Weissman, in which I tried to give my case as to why I believe this, that there is a very strong relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And on one foot, I spoke about the fact that the consequences of anti-Zionism are anti-Semitic. By that I mean that if your anti-Zionism leads you to support Hamas, then you essentially support dead Jews, you know what I mean? I spoke about the correlation that in most anti-Zionist movements right now, the rhetoric that you see is like infused with classic anti-Semitic tropes, like all over the place, blood libels, conspiracy theories, all of that. And then I spoke, and this is less easy to say quickly, but I used some theories from David Nirenberg, who writes about anti-Judaism. I said, like, what happens when the Jew becomes a symbol for all that is wrong in society, which there's a history of that happening across civilizations. And you can argue that today, Israel takes the place of the Jew. So Israel becomes the symbol for all that is wrong in society. So when that is the case, to me, that's like, that is definitely something that is very much tied to anti-Semitism. So it's not a perfect answer in the sense that I think it's much cleaner when you say all of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But I do think that the movement as a whole has 100% gone there.
Right, and I appreciate the nuance in your answer, and it's so interesting to think about, when you put it in the context of what's happening on social media, right, where it's kind of, everything is black or white, and there's this sense of cancel culture, and like what you said before, always trying to, point fingers and say you're done. We're basically asking of the Jewish community when someone says something, let's call it upsetting, like, can they sit and say, actually, this one was, they were saying they want this thing, which is somewhat constructive and has some anti-Semitism. It's very hard, and I think the reaction, we're also being backed into a corner, which is much around like, that was anti-Semitic, this person needs to be stopped, like that kind of thing. There's been like a movement in the Jewish community of like, who's going after us and how do we stop them? Yeah,
I think my concern there is less around nuance. Like, I'm okay kind of giving up a little bit of nuance right now. I think my concern there is more about strategy.
Great.
What I mean by that is that I think there's some examples that I'm seeing when I think people in my community are very quick to call out anti-Semitism. And sometimes I'm like, come on, we have to be strategic here.
Right.
We're not the biggest community in the world. We're tiny. So I am less interested in like the pursuit of truth with a capital T, like is this person, is that person, and actually much more interested in saying, what do we have to do to battle this dangerous thing, and how are we strategic about it? And not everything, if you're strategic, part of strategy is to know when you go to war and when you don't go to war.
Right.
When you cultivate allies and when you don't. So that's I think is important to me. I will also just add one more thing. I have people in my networks who continue to identify as anti-Zionist or non-Zionist, and I don't think that at least the ones that I'm thinking of in my mind are anti-Semitic, but I have told them straight out, you are literally helping anti-Semites.
Right.
And I don't know what that means anymore in terms of culpability. Like you can claim as much as you want that you don't believe in Hamas, whatever, but if you are literally allying yourself with people who support Hamas, what does this say about you? And you know, it's like, you know, the term with like Stalin's like useful idiots, whatever. Like I'm like, that's literally what you're doing right now, and it's really painful. But I do think it's time to call it out, and I can concede that you might not want Hamas's tactics to be used again, but I'm not sure if that takes away moral culpability if you ally yourself with an anti-Semitic movement.
Great. And so this is raising so much for me. So I think one of the things that I'm noticing, and we've had this conversation before a little bit around like you said, capital T, truth versus strategy on the ground. And I think that's, you know, I'm a student at heart. I love like seeking truth and learning, and sometimes it's hard to get in the, you know, the adult world of trying to figure out strategy and who to go along with. So I think, first of all, you know, what is the strategy? Right? You mentioned like that's not the strategy is not running around and just pointing fingers at whoever we can point a finger at and find smoking guns. Like, there's no one telling Jews and friends of Jews how to respond online and how to decide who to go after and who not to go after. But to the extent that we had a broader strategy, what is the strategy we should be taking on right now? And we had this like whole like cancel the universities, right? That was one of the first things that came out. Like, and I think there was legitimacy to some of that. But like, what's, you know, where are we going with this, right? You know, think about what you said originally, which was like, you know, we're seeing some crumbling in the society. Some things are broken. Is it like, let's point out everything that's broken, so it's broken, and nowhere to go from there? Or is there some strategy in trying to point out the brokenness and go somewhere with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what's hard is that I really believe that in many of these things we have to think of like an ecosystem of like strategies. So what do I mean by this?
Yeah, please.
I would say like I believe every single Jew, and also every person who cares about America and liberal democracy and classical liberal values, I do believe we are in a really dangerous place right now. Okay, so I think we need that mindset. Once we have that mindset, then I really believe that every person needs to ask themselves, what ecosystem am I in, and where do I have a lever of influence to make things better? And that's why it's a little bit hard to give like a one-size-fits-all answer. Because if you are in the board of a university, you will do one thing. If you work at a hospital, you will do another. If you are a journalist, it's something else. I 100% believe that every single person has a role to play. And I'll speak as a religious person, that God gave us certain talents and certain places to be in. We can go to Esther right now and touch on that, right? But I really do believe that. But that's almost what makes it hard. Like when I speak with students and when I speak with different people, and everybody's like, what do we do? And if you give like a one-size-fits-all answer, I actually think you're going to be counterproductive. Because let's say there's somebody that their strategy has to do everything behind the scenes, because they can actually be more successful doing that. And there's somebody else who would actually have to like bring up outrage. So it's hard. It's hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer, but the question always has to be, what am I accomplishing with this? What are unintended consequences? To be outraged as a form of therapy to deal with what we're going through right now, I don't think it's great. And I don't mean to sound like insensitive, but I do think that at times we might not be thinking as strategically to say, what am I going for right now? What's my lever of influence? What am I trying to change? And again, sometimes it means going to war openly, but it has to be done strategically. Like, who are your allies? Who are you working with? Like, you know what I mean?
It's interesting. So you raise a couple things for me there as well. One is, I've mentioned this to you before, that I'm starting to get phone calls from people from all over the place. You know, my child is at this university and they don't feel safe in their sorority. A sentence I never thought I would hear around Judaism. I thought it would be other things. We've come a long way and then gone back a long way. And then other people who, I work in this corporate space and I'm a Jew there and I feel like an outsider there with DEI. I guess what I want to ask is, you know, I think there's the advice for those people, but that to me feels more like feeling safe and surviving, which I hope is not the only bar we're looking for. You know, we're talking about having strategies here. What does success look like? Is it the return of liberal democracy, like fixing America? Is it something about how Jews are portrayed in the world? Is it ever fixable? Is this just like, we're going to come back to this no matter what? You know, I grew up with never again, right? But what are we going for?
So I think we have to hold two goals at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's really hard. But I think we have to, number one, fight for our values. So if we believe that a good society, because it's good for America and for Jews, a society, for example, that has a free inquiry of ideas, that has viewpoint diversity, that has moderation, that has a healthy political culture, fight for that with everything you have. Okay? Invest in the candidates running for office who are going to represent your values. Make connections like in civic societies and civic organizations. If you're inside a corporation, see what you can do to have the right processes there. Like we have to 100% fight. Okay, and I'm not saying that the fight looks the same for every person. I think sometimes the greatest fights are done quietly. You have to be strategic.
Yeah, strategy is different, but the goal you're laying out there is kind of like...
we're fighting for the soul of this country.
For America. Yeah. Great, okay.
Yeah. And at the same time, so it's like you have to do both.
Right. And just to be clear, this fighting for the soul, this is not a Republican versus Democrat thing.
Oh no, 100%. I think that I think America needs a healthy Republican and a healthy Democratic Party to kind of survive, and we have a long way to go. And this is the other thing I've been thinking about, though. I think that we cannot just be in warrior mode. And when I speak to students in college or other places, psychologically, they cannot be in warrior mode. And I also think that we have to almost like, I'm not going to say it so elegantly, we have to almost like hedge our bets. Am I saying that right with like my English?
Yeah, I think so. Depends what you're going to say next, but yes.
So this is what I mean. This is what I mean, Justin. I mean like, we need to have hope, and we need to fight, and we don't know what's going to happen. And I think for a very long time, American Jews have had the luxury of living in like a golden age for Jewry and for American values. And part of what we have to do, even as we fight for those values, we also have to almost like have contingency plans. And what do I mean by that? Part of that is like becoming stronger, becoming tougher, letting some things roll off our back. Do you get what I'm saying right now? Like, also becoming stronger is like when I meet with young, you know, I did a campus tour. I spoke in a lot of campuses. And it's very funny because I felt, I'm not Chabad, I love Chabad, but I'm not Chabad. But I felt like I was Chabad. Because after every talk, I would have students coming to me. And my first question to them was, do you have a place to go for Friday night dinner? Because to me, that's part of what it means to become strong right now, to become resilient, to understand that we're in this for the long run. This is not going to be resolved in a year. This is like the work of a generation or more to figure out. So it's almost like we have to fight with everything we have and also be resilient. And we can become more resilient. Like there's muscles that we can activate. It's not just like you're not resilient or not resilient. Like you can literally work on figuring out how do I as an individual and how do I as a community. And part of that is having thick social networks. Part of that is having spiritual strength to know that we have a 4,000-year-old tradition that is nourishing us, that is moving us forward. Part of that is figuring out how to become less dependent on the acceptance of those who are never going to accept us if we're pro-Israel. Like there's a certain work that we have to do there, even as we fight for the world that we want. So it's really hard, but I think that that's kind of like what we have to do right now.
It's interesting you frame it that way, because in the previous week we spoke about Purim and Mordechai's response being like, on one hand, gather the Jews, defend yourself, defeat your enemies, but on the other hand, we suddenly have Mishloach Manot and Matanot Evyonim, these community building mitzvot, that you're meant to invest in community, give gifts to your friends, take care of the poor. And what I hear you saying is that there's two sides. One is the external, the fight that needs to happen out here, but there's also the internal strength in the community, invest in the community.
Yeah, and we can probably find places where the binary breaks, but I think that it's like you fight the haters.
Yeah.
Fight. But also we gotta be strong, and there's a certain, and I say this, and speaking about myself, so I'm not like rebuking other people.
Yeah.
Like there's a certain softness that I have seen in myself from being here. A certain like our parents and grandparents did not have this softness.
Right.
Because they, or at least mine, like they did not expect certain things, right? Like my father grew up in Argentina,
Right.
where like to be a Jew at that time in Buenos Aires, like you could get insults in the street.
Right.
But that was like, okay. And it toughened him up in a certain way. And I'm not saying, God forbid, that the blessing of American Judaism and flourishing is bad, but it does make you soft, right? Safety, security, prosperity, being totally accepted.
Right.
It makes you less resilient when challenges come. So part of what we're doing right now is we've got to fight really hard because we don't want this to be the end of an amazing story, right? We're going to fight for that. And we have a lot of, and I think it's important, we have resources, we have strength that we have to use, and also we have to become new people.
Right. It's interesting. When you mentioned having a contingency plan, I didn't expect you to necessarily go in the direction of community building.
What
right?
do you think? Passports?
Well, there could be two. One is passports, right? One is both of us are members of family who switched countries in the past century, right? We were somewhere and we're not there anymore. Me from Poland, you from Argentina, your husband from Egypt. And that's number one. And the other is, looking across the ocean, the idea of like
Israel,
the ability to defend yourself.
Yep.
Like literally defend yourself, right? And so it was interesting, you say toughness, I thought of like Tzahal, but it was a little bit like toughness, like can you navigate the anti-Semitism?
No, but I think you need both. And I'm somebody who will continue to fight for us to have an IDF in Israel and support the efforts there. But I think you need both, and I'll tell you why. Sometimes I speak with young students in college, and I have found them more fragile. Not everybody, but some of them are more fragile than people their age in Israel going into Gaza.
Right.
You get what I'm saying?
Of course.
Okay, and I think that that's a project that we have to work on.
What's going on there? What do you think's going on there? Is that bad parenting on our behalf?
It's so many things. Some of it is American parenting, 100%. And some of it has been if you live in Israel, like your neighborhood toughens you up.
Right.
And you don't have a choice but to pick up a gun and go and fight. And here it's like universities, like the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Like there's been like a coddling,
right,
and a closing and just a pampering. And we need to actually like figure this out. How do we create strong and resilient Jews? That's almost like part of our project. It's we're going to fight the haters. We are. We're going to fight for our America, for our Jewish communities, and we need to become new Jews. It's almost like a Zionist project, actually, because Zionism, right?
Right.
Zionism was in Western Europe. It was like Herzl and his friends basically saying, "This diasporic Jews, we are going to become new Jews."
But we're going to go somewhere to be new Jews, right? And
yeah,
we're saying we should stay.
Okay, that's a different conversation. That's okay. I'll say two things. Number one, I actually think that right now it is incredibly important for Israel's existence to have a strong Jewish community in America and to have a healthy America. So I do think that's like really important strategically. And number two, I do think, I have been speaking about this actually, I think Zionism is not just a movement to create, a Jewish national home in the land of Israel. Zionism is also about agency. It's about saying, like, we might not be able to change the world and how much certain parts of the world hate us. Not everybody, thank God, right? We might not be able to change that, but guess what? We can change ourselves, and we can stand up tall. And I 100% think that we have a big role to play right now in America. In kind of taking part in this, again, not to sound too dramatic, but in this civilizational war that we're in right now.
Sure. Okay. All right, let's turn. I want you to start using the word Amalek for a second here.
Okay.
And just play with it, because I think there's something almost mystifying about it, right? There's I think we have. I'll let you go first, to be frank, but I think we're going to be coming to Parshat Zachor. You lead the downtown minyan. How are you thinking about preparing intellectually, emotionally, spiritually for what it means to remember Amalek? What does that mean to you more broadly, and what does that mean to you this year?
Yeah, I'll start by answering by almost like naming the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Like I have no problem with remembering Amalek, and I can tell you what it means to me. But I also know there's many circles, including legal spaces like the Criminal Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court of Justice. I do think there's many circles where people have accused Jews that by speaking about Amalek, and that by bringing up Amalek, especially right now, we are ourselves adopting a genocidal kind of rhetoric. So I just want to name that. I disagree with that, but I want to name that.
Right.
Let me just name the argument. If it's okay, I'll make it even a little bit sharper.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not agreeing with this, okay? The argument is that in the Bible, in Exodus, right, and later on as well, Deuteronomy, I believe, we do not only encounter Amalek, we are not only commanded to remember it, we are also commanded to destroy its memory, and we are also commanded to eradicate this people, that is Amalek. So the logic is, again, not that I'm agreeing with it, the logic is if you're a rabbi or a politician or whatever, and you say, Amalek, we have to remember Amalek, think about what happened with Hamas or whatever, the critique is, oh, this means that you now want to destroy Amalek and kill every member of whatever nation you're calling Amalek.
Right, and so, I think I think the way the Netanyahu office navigated this, as I understand it, was kind of saying that in the Torah, it talks about the 5 books of Moses. It talks about that God will obliterate and blot out Amalek, and that it's our obligation to remember. But then we have the story of King Saul in the book of Samuel, where God explicitly says to Saul, "Go attack Amalek because of what they did to us. Kill everyone, women, children, adults, all the animals." And Saul, of course, goes ahead and does that and captures the king instead of killing him, and lets the animals live because he says, "I'm going to use the animals for sacrifice." And God is very unhappy. God says, "That's it. You've lost. That's the moment. You lost the throne. You're not going to be the king anymore." So it feels like there's certainly a moment there where, you're right, in biblical language, there's like this needs to happen. This is not only a good thing, like an obligation.
Yeah, great. So I myself don't feel all the angst, like, oh, can I mention Amalek? Am I then adopting something bad? I just don't think that our traditional texts actually lend to that. So I'll tell you the way that I see it.
Yeah.
So for me, it's very clear. When we talk about Amalek, we are talking about a historical enemy of the Jewish people. Now, the language that you used at the beginning, Justin, when you introduced our conversation, you said Amalek attacked unprovoked. And that is true. It was unprovoked. Amalek attacked the weakest people as part of the Jewish people. But I want to add one more thing here, because I think that's what gives us the essence of Amalek. Amalek attacked for no rational gain. These are a nomadic people that have think about the Israelites. They were just slaves.
Right.
They left Egypt. They don't have a land. So there's no they're not attacking them because of territory, right? They're not attacking them to take wealth. They are attacking them for no rational reason. And I want to here quote some of the teachings from my teacher, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory. When Rabbi Sachs taught and wrote about Amalek, he would say, what Amalek symbolizes is something that many in the West have forgotten. It's that sometimes we have enemies, okay? Enemies that are not acting in a way that is rational in the way that we think of it. What do I mean by this? Sometimes in the West we think, oh, it's just a conflict. And we can probably figure this out if we tease out each other's interest. That person over there, right? What they want is the same thing that I want. They want to earn a living and feed their children and live a long life. And if we are both rational actors in this way, then we just need to figure this out, right? Okay. Amalek is not that. Amalek, and I would say here, I think the Nazis are one of the greatest examples of this. Whenever the Nazis, and I know your family, Justin, you've spoken very movingly about your family, those who perished and those who survived the Holocaust. But there's so many instances in which the Nazis literally hindered their own war efforts because they wanted to kill more Jews, right? So there's nothing rational about it. There's nothing there that we can almost understand. When I think today about jihadists, okay? So those who have a certain martyr-like extremist jihadist philosophy, they are not rational actors in the sense that they don't want a future in which their kids just like grow up happily and everything is good. They have a different way of viewing the universe. So I actually feel post-October 7th to get up and to say Amalek exists. There is such a thing as an enemy of everything I hold dear. Not because we disagree on certain key things, but because our entire value system is so different that you are not a rational actor and you're willing to do terrible, terrible evil, even if you gain nothing rationally from it. I think that is just like so incredibly important, and it's almost like it is almost dangerous for us to forget it. It's so dangerous. This was like the big thing that, like, when you speak to people in Israel, when they talk about Hamas on October 7th, they said, what was the problem? That we had a failed consensus. The consensus that we had was what? That Hamas leaders wanted to stay in power and wanted to rule Gaza, and that they would never attack Israel because they knew how quickly we would come and destroy them. So that's almost like assuming that my opponent is a rational being and that we share this. And what happened on October 7th, the barbarism, the brutality, the glee, right? It just shows you Amalek. Now, I want to add something, but I don't know if you want to agree or disagree with that.
So I have a million questions, but I'll let you add in a second. I think a couple of things that come out of that for me is, one is, do you think that, because I think that I was, at the time, this is a terrible thing to say, but I'm just going to say it, I thought that if Hamas had gone after Israeli soldiers and men, and done the things they did, but just the Israeli soldiers and men, that the entire world would be behind them from day one, and there would be, like, it would just, people would be cheering for Hamas. The fact that they chose to do what they did to the elderly, to women, to children, to me felt like a mistake on their behalf. Like, how could they do that? They gave up some points in the political arena by doing that. Is your thinking on that they're just playing a total different game, so they don't even know about that rule? Or is your thinking on that they're very aware of how we think of those things, and despite the fact that the West thinks of those things that way, they went ahead and did it the way they did it for certain reasons?
Yeah, so I listened to an interview recently in the Dan Senior podcast, Call Me Back, with Matti Friedman. Matti is a good friend. And Matti made the following argument, which I thought was enlightening. Matti said, Hamas understood the West more than we did. We might have thought that they miscalculated with that, but Hamas might have combined two things: their own jihadist mentality and their own understanding of the weakness of the West, that even if they did all of that, they would still have tremendous support.
Got it.
Right? So I'm hearing more and more people who think that wasn't a miscalculation, that was, intentional. And also, it's almost like you have to evaluate Hamas with how they thought the West would react, and it's just their own internal kind of like, what are they gaining from this, right? But I want to add something though, Justin, to this. Like, this is the way I think about Amalek. Amalek to me represents this unmitigated like evil, and it's an evil that we have to have no illusions over. And it's hard. It's hard to live in a world with this level of evil, right? To me, this doesn't translate that if I say, I see Amalek here on October 7th, it doesn't translate to me that we then have a commandment to kill an entire people and children and all of that. As a religious Jew, I've inherited the Bible, I've inherited the Mishnah, the Talmud, a whole host of tradition, and we have so much tradition going back to the Talmud, Maimonides, and others who say, today we don't know who Amalek is exactly, and we do not have that praxis of kind of like carrying that out. Do you get what I'm saying with that? So if that's the case, I can feel very confident in saying, this is Amalek, and we have to open our eyes to it. And to me, it doesn't necessarily indicate that what I am saying at the same time is we're going to go and like destroy an entire people. Partially because I am an inheritor of a tradition that over the centuries has kind of said, we still have the idea, we're going to remember it, we're going to read Zachor every year, we're going to read the Megillah of Purim, but it doesn't come together with what Prophet Samuel told King Saul to do.
Right, so it's interesting. So I wonder, first of all, you ascribe it to the Jewish tradition. I wonder how much of it is also a liberal tradition, right? Being an American, a sensitivity around.
No, Maimonides was not an American.
No, for sure. But I'm saying, I think also like we, thank God, live in an era where, aside from this extreme case like Hamas right now, there's an expectation that war is fought among certain people and civilians are kept to the side, but that, you know, that hasn't always historically been the case. And I think that, you know, in America there's almost like a, especially after Iraq, Afghanistan, all those things, there's like a fear of hurting anyone, right? There's a sense of like avoid war at all costs, right? That's why you have this reaction from everyone like ceasefire now, peace now. There was no sense of like, there's no sense of like, well, if someone's playing a different game than you, which you described, and they're willing to come to your doorstep and kill your women and children, of course you don't want to be lower to the level of doing that back to them, right? But you're trying to navigate, you know, I guess the best way to ask that question is, let's put on one hand, we don't want to have Saul's command to kill the women and children and the animals. That's one hand. And on the other hand, we have, this feels like this is actual Amalek, right? We were supposed to remember, we forgot remembering, here's Amalek in front of us. Where in between there are we meant to be? You know, how are we meant to respond if if it is Amalek, if it's somebody who says something different? They're not playing your game anymore.
Yeah, well, I think, for example, the way Israel is waging war in Gaza, and we can have conversation over different moments. I'm not speaking about moments necessarily, but when you look at the big picture, when you look at the amount of civilians in densely populated areas with terrorists underground, Israel is not doing what the Prophet Samuel told Saul to do. But I'll just add something, Justin, here. I don't think it's just Hamas, and I think it's really important to name this. Like, part of what, and I'm not, like, I've read a lot of people, so I don't even know who I'm quoting right now. Okay, apologies to whoever political scientist I read on this.
Yeah, Plony.
Yeah, okay, good, anonymous, yeah. But right now, part of the reason that many people are concerned is that it's not just the Israel-Hamas war. Hamas is an arm of Iran, okay? And you can see what happened with Iran, Hamas, and Israel. You can see that in the shadow of what happened with Russia and Ukraine. You can see that in the shadow of what's potentially going to happen with Taiwan and China. And you can talk about the West having forgotten that it has enemies and that there are entire countries out there with a lot of wealth and resources who really do not like American and Western hegemony, who don't believe in freedom, who don't believe in individual liberty, who are dictatorships and are run by tyrants like China, Russia, and Iran. And we don't want the same things. And it's a huge question because I think we have become complacent and we don't want war. And that's part of what makes me nervous, that we have forgotten the meaning of what it means to be, to have to fight.
Which is so interesting because we literally have Israel across the ocean, which is like, has had to do that and be prepared for that since its inception. And somehow over here in America, we've been like drifting in the other direction.
Yeah, and you have a lot of people in both the right and the left, it's like, you know, horseshoe theory, who are advocating for more isolationist policies. And I'm like, do we read history? Every time that there's been like a vacuum left, like other players take
Who's going to fill it, right?
Right. It's not going to just, like, do we want Chinese hegemony?
Right.
Do we want Russian or Iranian hegemony kind of dictating how the world stage is being played?
Right, right. And so then tell me a little bit, I know that you are someone who spends a lot of time around teens recently, but also around college students and around academia as well. You know, you mentioned kind of, we missed it. We haven't been paying attention. The world has been evolving and there are enemies that are you know, making chess moves on the chessboard against us right now, or we're lost in the cloud. You know, what do you see happening among the youth and campus today? You know, the anti-Semitism is a big piece of it, I assume, but there's even more than that. Like, where are we going wrong in how we're educating people today?
I want to first say where we're going right. Okay. That's really important. No, it's really important for me. Like, because there's a lot of doom saying, and, you know, I can do that really well. So I can, like, you know what I mean? Like, out pessimist you. You know, go deep into the darkness. I have when I think about where I draw spiritual strength and hope and optimism right now, part of it is from Israel, but part of that is from what I am seeing with young Jews in America. I think that there has been, too many professional Jews, so like leaders and educators and rabbis and philanthropists, for a long time have assumed that young American Jews only want like a very shallow engagement and do-it-yourself Judaism and like no collectivity and no connectivity, and that they're going to reject Jewish peoplehood, and like there's been a lot of predictions of that. And part of what October 7th did is it triggered all of these young people. And I have been just in awe. I have been in awe of how many young Jews I am meeting every single day who are standing up and they are willing to pay social prices for this, and they are seeing things. They have moral clarity. It's not everybody, but like they have moral clarity. They want to invest in Jewish community. They see the rise of anti-Semitism, and it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And I really hope that those who work in the Jewish community, that we become deserving of that energy, and that we actually help nourish it to build a stronger Jewish community.
And going back to what you said earlier, instead of worrying about them and deciding for them, invite them to your Shabbat table.
Or help them host a Shabbat table.
Or help them host their own Shabbat table.
No, but really, it's really, there's so much of it, and I'm grateful to be surrounded by so many amazing young people.
Got it. And then we talked about Amalek. Immediately what came to mind was the example of Hamas a little bit, but tell me a little bit, is there Amalek in America right now, and how would you describe that?
What do you mean?
I don't know. You mentioned that Amalek, using Rabbi Sachs' lovely, beautiful, and powerful words, is something about kind of baseless hatred for the purpose of not having an upside. And so now we see this massive growth in anti-Semitism, for example. We even see examples of, as you mentioned before, there's a million conflicts in the world, and then we see people focusing on the Jews and Israel as like the number one thing. So does it feel like that is hatred that has nothing to gain? Does it fit into that same mold? Yeah,
that's a great question. I have to think about it. I don't know. I think it's complicated because on the one hand you have this hatred, like the way Iran, and on the other hand, also Jews serve a very useful role when it comes to anti-Semitism. Like you can kind of blame the ills of society and the Jews and kind of gain something from that.
Right.
So I'm not sure. I have to think about it.
Okay. Yeah. The language you just used made me think of Israel also. There was kind of, one of the threads coming out when this started was that this happened because to prevent normalization of relationships between like Israel and Saudi Arabia and the growth of Israel and other countries, and that this is like, the Israelis and the Palestinians are just proxies in a war between bigger countries that are, and they're suffering terribly. And first of all, I think that's a crazy thing to even think about. But second of all, also the same thing in America, where suddenly like there's a bigger argument happening in America, and somehow Jews are the ones that get thrown into the fire as the ones that are at the center of that debate.
Well, I'm not sure if it's somehow. Jews are always been very prominent minorities. So Jews are often at the center of these things.
Well, by the way, what do you think that's I know everyone asks this question, but is that just the way God made the world? Is that there's always going to be people who hate us in every generation and rise up against, that's built into the fabric of the computer system here? Or what is that? What do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that when you have a prominent minority, that combination, that it's prominent, which means it's very visible, but it's a minority, which means it can sometimes be attacked with impunity, that's what makes that's what makes anti-Semitism so kind of ripe. Now the question is, do you see the hand of God there? Or is that just the way that history developed? And whatever, that's a whole other theological.
But there are other minority groups. I'm not going to start naming names, but there are other minority groups that are super successful in all different fields, and there's not like a global.
I don't think you have another minority group that has been a prominent minority across so many ecosystems.
Right, but even in our history, do you
I don't know who the other group.
Right, but each time we have anti-Semitism, it's not always because Jews are being successful in that country, is it?
I said prominent.
So define prominent for us.
Prominent is that it's highly visible, and end up being easily used as symbols of something. Right?
That's so interesting because one of the knocks on Jews is that we can shapeshift, right? Like you can't tell that someone's a Jew and they walk on the street. It's different than other minority groups.
Okay.
But we're prominent because of our last names.
Because of our last names, because we tend to build communities, because we tend to honor Judaism across time and space. You know,
that's interesting. Well, that raises for me, a third explanation, which I didn't say at the beginning because it's not obvious from the text, but the rabbis go on to say is that Amalek descended from Esav, and that Esav had jealousy of Yaakov, and Esav commanded his descendants to attack the Jews, and that really at the heart of this there's an element of jealousy there. Is that we have this thing, we want to be a light unto the nations in some way, and we build these beautiful communities. Is there a jealousy thing here?
Well, what do you think, Justin?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I remember. I'll say another thing. Maybe it's controversial as well. I remember thinking about Hatzalah, for example, which is I give to Hatzalah.
What is Hatzalah?
Hatzalah is a emergency relief service that is volunteer run there in Israel, and there in many communities in America as well. And so I think part of the amazing thing about it is that people are on call all day and can be called to get help, and they tend to come much faster than typical ambulatory services. And so on one hand, it's an amazing thing, a community to self-organize and to say, in addition to, and we have that in other communities, not just Jewish, we have volunteer firefighters, all this kind of thing, but we're having a principle that says we're going to volunteer to take care of ourselves, right? But then I can imagine someone else being like, wait, like, I live on the same block as you guys, and I don't have the number for it, so I don't know about that. So being like angry, like, how could you build this thing? And then, you know, my thinking on that is that it's building a community is a model that other people should build. They should build communities as well, but we are a minority. We can't build a community. There can't be Jewish Hatzalah volunteers that are going to cover all of North America because there's not enough Jews to do that. But I wonder, I feel like there are moments sometimes where it's like, I champion building community. You said it before. We need to build a stronger Jewish community. I feel it very, very strongly. I feel like, you know, we watched the Oscars last night, and there was all this, like, you know, Jews in media, and then people are hearing things they didn't want to hear through the Oscars, right? And there's like, well, we used to invest in our own media. Now we're investing in public media and trying to leave our Judaism at the door. Like, I think on one hand, there's an importance to coming back to investing in Jewish community. I think there's a question of how do you do it in a way. I don't think you should be scared of jealousy, but I think you should be inviting people to copy things that they can learn positive from you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this question. I don't have a perfect answer
because
it's hard. I would agree with you that the way I would say it is that there's certain structures and communities that we invest in that could potentially kind of strengthen animosity or invite animosity, Hatzalah being just one example of that. I think it's really complicated. I think that at the end of the day, our tradition is such that I think if we followed the multiple precepts of our religion, then without having to worry about other people's animosity, we would both do this, but also invest in just regular ambulances for everybody. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, I think I think that our tradition is really invites us to behave in a way that is that thinks broadly and not just about us. That's number one.
But which we do, right? If we have
100%.
The museums
100%.
and art, like there's a lot of Jewish philanthropy propping up so many parts of society.
Right, but the reason I'm saying this is that I also don't think that we need to. This is what I'm struggling with, and I'm naming it as a real struggle. I'm struggling between what does it mean to say. To want to avoid victim blaming. I do not want to blame Jews for anti-Semitism. I think that is wrong, for many, many reasons.
Yeah.
And at the same time, how do we have agency? And we say, where are places where we are tiny people, we can do some things better in terms of like having allies and fighting this together. So I kind of want to have both, and it's really complicated. So,
we have to be a little strategic without blaming ourselves.
But it's really complicated. I don't believe in victim blaming, because I think that, if we do it, I always say, like, just use this language and use it to another minority group. You would feel uncomfortable, right? Right. Like, there's misogyny because women do the following.
Yeah.
We don't accept that, do we?
Right.
Okay. At the same time, and maybe this is me being controversial as a woman, as a feminist, I'm like, are there things a woman could also do better in general to advance more, to work out?
Right.
I actually think so personally. Right. So there's like an interesting place there. How do you look at structural animosity, and do you resist victim blaming? And also, how do you say we have agency?
Beautiful. All right, so I think, first of all, thank you for everything. I think one thing that I'm sitting with now, coming back to our conversation around Amalek, is if we have an obligation, a mitzvah, to remember Amalek, Zachor, and that maybe sometimes we forget that. And sometimes it takes a couple generations and we forget it, as has happened here. And then we have the other extreme, which is the idea of actually a mitzvah to blot out Amalek in the story of Saul. I think something that I'm thinking about coming from this is the idea that it's constantly evolving. The same way our tradition evolves and we rethink how do we make sense of certain mitzvot, it feels like we're being forced to ask the question of what the mitzvah of Amalek is this year. It feels like Amalek is in front of us and we need to think about how to handle it. And like anything other Jewish question, it's not simple as let's go look up what it says in the Torah. It's let's evolve the conversation from previous generations and let's continue that conversation and let's sort out how do we attack Amalek today? And I think you shared beautifully that it seems like Israel certainly is doing everything in its power to deeply confront Amalek in a way that fits in with Jewish values.
They don't have a choice.
Right, they don't have a choice. And I think there's a second question for us, which is how to, to the extent there is Amalek in America, which we talked around a little bit, what's the approach for North American Jews? What's our way forward there?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't believe in one size fits all, but
of course.
I think Amalek demands, number one, to get rid of illusions.
Yeah.
So get rid of illusions,
yeah.
Okay? And the second is, I think that I really believe this is a moment in which every person needs to ask themselves, what can I do in my circumstances, in my capacity, with whatever networks I have? Like, we gotta use everything to fight for a better America.
Mm-hmm.
And by a better America, to me, a result of that is a safer place for Jews, mm-hmm. and not just Jews, but many others, mm-hmm. And also a better world in which countries like Israel and Ukraine and others have the chance to fight off evil.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Amen.
Amen. Michal, thank you so much. Such a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah,
really.
Thanks for having me, Justin. It's good to see you.
All right. Thank you.